We believe that some stories must be challenged. Not because they're flawed, but because the ones that last, the masterpieces like the one we're unpacking today, they contain some really difficult truths about the moral universe we all live in.
And this is part of our continuing inquiry, isn't it?
It is. We're looking at how fiction illuminates moral truth, human reasoning, and the sometimes brutal reality of ethical asymmetry.
It's so important to remember that. Fiction, even though it's imagined, it reflects the moral architecture of our reality. The conflicts you see on a stage force us to confront these really hard choices about justice.
About survival, even.
Exactly.
And as we apply our systematic critique today, we do want to start by acknowledging you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book summaries.
Right, and we aren't just approaching this randomly. We're applying systematic frameworks.
Tell us a bit about that.
We're using the step-by-step critical thinking model of Paul and Elder, which really emphasizes intellectual standards like clarity, logical depth.
Things like that.
Yes. And an intellectual ethics framework inspired by thinkers like Adler, the core principle of the Golden Rule, and even the civic ideals from the U.S. preamble.
So liberty, justice, equality.
All of it. We're using that comprehensive lens to look at a text that basically defines tragedy, Shakespeare's Hamlet.
And we want to open with the central philosophical question the book raises, one that feels tragically relevant, really, to any era. What does this story claim about justice when innocence alone cannot protect the innocent?
Wow. That question, it just immediately focuses you on the stakes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Hamlet isn't just about a prince seeking revenge. It's a kind of philosophical laboratory.
A laboratory for what?
It asks whether a single conscience can stay morally clean while trying to get revenge in a corrupted world where, as the text says, something is rotten.
That's the core tension, then. That huge gap between realizing a profound injustice has happened and then, well, figuring out a morally justifiable way to actually fix it.
And you see that conflict everywhere. Revenge versus justice, thought versus action, even sanity versus madness. It all contributes to the hero's staggering intellectual burden.
Critics seem to always point to three main thematic pillars that define that burden.
They do. And the first one is the impossibility of certainty. This is absolutely crucial.
Right.
The protagonist spends the entire play needing proof. Is the ghost telling the truth? Is his uncle really guilty?
And that leads directly into the second pillar, doesn't it? The complexity of action.
Absolutely, because he demands that certainty. His path toward action is just excruciatingly slow.
He knows that once he acts, the consequences are absolute. They're irreversible.
And that brings up the third pillar, the mystery of death, that question of what comes after, the undiscovered country. That's what makes his intellect both his noblest strength and, ironically, his fatal liability.
So he delays action precisely because he understands the profound moral and maybe even theological stakes of violence.
He does.
Okay, let's unpack this idea of political and moral decay. Where does it all begin?
Well, from an ethical standpoint, the play dramatizes the ultimate political catastrophe.
Yeah.
It shows what happens when political authority is founded on murder and deceit.
It starts with the regicide, the murder of the rightful king.
Yes, and that act, plus the hasty, morally suspect marriage that follows, it immediately poisons the body politic from the very top.
Claudius, the new king, he really embodies this corruption, doesn't he? It's personal, it's familial, and it's civic. His entire rule is illegitimate.
It rests on fratricide.
So when we look at this through our ethical framework, this foundational crime, it violates any standard of reciprocity you could call the Golden Rule.
Absolutely. The Golden Rule asks you to treat others as you would want to be treated. So if Claudius demands absolute loyalty from his subjects, how can he possibly expect it when his own power comes from the ultimate betrayal of his own brother?
It's that refusal to apply universal ethical standards to oneself. That's where the rot begins.
And it destroys domestic tranquility, too, which is one of the aims of the preamble. The nation is literally being ruled by a criminal.
Which sets up Hamlet's core dilemma, that ethical asymmetry we mentioned.
Yes.
He recognizes a duty, a civic duty, you could say, to restore a just order, but he has no morally clean path to do it. Every single option he considers implicates him in the same kind of violence he's condemning.
And the asymmetry is just.
Yeah.
It's profound. The usurper, Claudius, he acts decisively. No moral scruples at all.
Right. He murders, he seizes power, he throws a party.
Meanwhile, the conscientious avenger, Hamlet, he hesitates.
Yeah.
And he hesitates precisely because he takes guilt and eternal consequences and the moral law so seriously, He has to fight a war in his own conscience. Claudius just acts.
This brings us back to his famous delay then. It's so often seen as just weakness, paralysis. But how do we justify that agonizing pause to a modern audience, one that really values efficiency and quick justice?
Well, the critical reading is much deeper than simple weakness. It's seen as a rational, even a theologically informed attempt to make sure any act of retribution is truly just, not merely vengeful.
He needs confirmation.
He does. The ghost's word isn't enough proof, because, as he reasons, it could be a demon sent to trick him into damnation. So he's trying to apply universal ethical standards, clarity, sufficient evidence, to this incredibly ambiguous and dangerous situation. He wants justice, not just blood.
So if the core conflict is defined by the protagonist's intellectual struggle, what about the other characters? That's where we get the contrast with the other Revengers.
Exactly. If Hamlet embodies this scrupulous doubt, the book gives us these contrasting, revenging sons to explore other moral logics, other ways people react to injustice.
You have Laertes, who is all about impulsive, honor-bound retaliation. He just erupts in rage after his father's death.
A passionate rage. And then you contrast him with Fortinbras, who represents a much more disciplined, politically channeled ambition.
And this contrast is vital, isn't it? It exposes the asymmetries between, say, courage and recklessness, honor versus bloodlust.
It does. Laertes is so easily manipulated by Claudius because his motivation is just pure, quick vengeance. It's not ordered justice. He's willing to burn down the entire kingdom to satisfy his personal grief. That's recklessness, not liberty.
Fortinbras, though, he channels his ambition politically, militarily. He's dealing with national honor, with land claims.
He is a man of action, but his actions are politically contained. They're disciplined, unlike Laertes' emotional explosion.
Yeah.
The audience is really invited to judge which of these, if any, aligns with an ethic of real justice.
The environment they're all operating in is just.
Yeah.
It's a study in political theater.
Fundamentally, the entire court structure, the rituals, the diplomatic shows, the staged piety, it's all a mask.
A mask for a regime born of crime?
And think about the constant surveillance.
Oh, yes. The play within the play, the spying, the obsession with seeming versus being.
It all highlights how power relies on these scripted, dishonest performances to hide the truth. Not just from the subjects, but maybe more tragically, from the rulers themselves. They become blind to their own moral decay.
This is why scholars read that pervasive sense of rot and contagion as such a powerful metaphor.
It's unavoidable. It suggests that a ruler's private sin doesn't stay private. It metastasizes into social decay. It distorts justice, erodes trust.
And it invites foreign intervention, like the threat from Fortinbras.
Right. And if we apply that Paul and Elder critical thinking framework here, we see exactly why the court collapses.
Their public reasoning is completely distorted.
It's systematically distorted by self-interest and deceit. They refuse to apply universal ethical standards like honesty, clarity, fairness to those in power. Their whole thought process is compromised because they won't start from the premise that their king is a murderer.
It's a closed loop of deceit. No real truth can get in. The people who should be checking the king's power are too busy spying and staging performances.
Not seeking justice.
And that focus on honest reflection, on testing assumptions against principles, that's really what we're aiming for here.
Absolutely. And if you're finding this process of critical reflection useful, where we systematically test assumptions against established principles, we encourage you to seek out more of this at Mindful Moments.
That's our YouTube channel.
Yes, offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques. We're trying to inspire reflection and rational thought. And it's also valuable for aspiring authors. We take complex ideas and try to make them accessible through this kind of structured analysis.
Now let's move beyond the politics into the inner life. We have to talk about madness.
Madness, yes. Whether it's real, feigned, or somewhere in that painful middle ground, it functions as a form of emotional logic in the play.
How so?
It allows the protagonist to reveal truths that sober rhetoric just couldn't safely express in that kind of totalitarian environment.
So when characters seem unmoored, their strange language is often the only thing that can expose the court's moral contradictions and the unbearable tension between what justice demands and what a human can actually endure.
It's a safe way to speak truth to power, even if it costs him his sanity.
And that elevates the stakes from emotional to existential.
Immediately. Hamlet's fixation on death, on decay, on the afterlife. It pushes the drama far beyond simple revenge. It becomes a meditation on what it even means to be under conditions of such radical uncertainty.
He's stuck, isn't he, between two beliefs?
Completely. On one hand, the hope that a divine court will eventually punish Claudius, that's the Christian eschatology. On the other, this terrifying fear that death is just meaningless decay, a skeptical, almost existential awareness.
That tension must be paralyzing.
And it is. Death becomes both the limit of human power, can't escape it, and the imagined site of ultimate answers. This links the play to these huge philosophical debates over whether any human justice system can ever match the impartiality of some transcendent judgment.
And the playwright uses such powerful symbolic language to communicate all this contamination.
The imagery is incredible. Poison, rot, disease, they all encode the idea that injustice isn't a simple private flaw. It's a systemic contaminant that seeps into every single relationship and institution.
It destroys everything.
And you see this most vividly in the graveyard imagery. Think about the protagonist holding the skull of the court jester, Yorick. That scene just compresses all the political and personal stakes of the play into one stark reminder of the physical fate we all share, regardless of rank or power.
Right. Mortality is the great equalizer. It makes the entire pursuit of earthly power and vengeance seem, well, absurd.
It's hard not to feel cynical after that scene.
You look at that skull, this great jester, and realize the courtly performances mean nothing in the end.
And we have to examine the narrative logic as it applies to the women in the play.
Gertrude and Ophelia.
Yes, the treatment of women, specifically through the protagonist's lens, it exposes both his personal bias and the deeply patriarchal assumptions of his world.
He projects his disgust with the court's corruption onto all women, really.
Which is a crucial part of the tragic structure. The narrative logic ensures that neither submissive compliance, like Ophelia's obedience to her father, nor romantic idealism gets rewarded.
It suggests that a society built entirely on male honor codes, on dynastic power and vengeance. It leaves women with few, if any, just options.
The personal tragedies, their despair, their destruction, are direct, unavoidable consequences of the political decay that Claudius started with his crime.
So, in our final assessment, we have to evaluate the play's overall philosophical coherence. Does this cascade of tragedy actually make sense, or is it just sensational violence?
From Adler's standpoint, which asks if a text has a single central argument, the book is profoundly coherent.
How so?
The plot, the characters, the themes, they all converge on that one large question.
Yeah.
Can reason and conscience navigate a world where political necessity and moral law collide?
So the tragedies aren't arbitrary. They flow rationally from that initial crime and from Hamlet's consistent character traits.
Exactly. His high intelligence fused with that scrupulous, agonizing doubt. His intelligence doesn't save him. In fact, it complicates every choice until he's just consumed by the violence.
The worldview is certainly complex. It oscillates between that hope for transcendent justice
and a deeply skeptical awareness of human frailty and the meaninglessness of the physical world.
So rather than offering a tidy lesson, the play itself models critical reflection.
That's a great way to put it. It models testing motives, questioning appearances, and acknowledging how limited our knowledge is when lives and kingdoms are on the line. It's a handbook for intellectual humility.
For many, its greatest achievement is honoring the complexity of moral choice. It refuses to just endorse vengeance or submission.
It forces the audience to wrestle with the dilemma long after the curtain falls.
And yet there is a powerful critical counterpoint. Some argue the play risks aestheticizing paralysis and suffering, turning moral catastrophe into beautiful language, and in doing so, maybe dulling our outrage at injustice.
That's a provocative idea. It suggests the art form itself might undermine the moral message.
Does focusing on the poetry distract us from the fact that a whole kingdom just collapsed because of corruption?
Precisely. But even that disagreement just confirms the work's power. It continues to provoke debate over whether its tragic ending reflects cosmic order or human failure or some complex mix of both.
The ultimate lesson isn't what to believe then, but how to think about impossible situations.
So the final, enduring lesson the story teaches isn't about success or failure in a traditional sense. It's about the immense cost of maintaining intellectual integrity, a scrupulous conscience when you're surrounded by corruption. It's a reminder that the search for perfect justice may be the most perilous journey of all.
And this critique drew on systematic approaches inspired by Paul and Elder's work on intellectual standards, by Mortimer J. Adler's emphasis on finding a text's central arguments, and by ethical reflection guided by the Golden Rule and the civic aims of the preamble.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. subscribe, and nourish your mind on the go.